Hey guys, tonight's story begins with a strange contradiction at the heart of post-war American life. The decade so often remembered for neat kitchens, polished smiles, and suburban comfort was also a decade in which many women were quietly swallowing pills just to get through ordinary days. Before we settle in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful, long-form history, a like is a simple way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past are your kind of thing, subscribing is a gentle way to keep them coming. Now, with that, let us step into the bright, carefully arranged world of 1950s America and look at what it costs to keep it looking so calm. To a modern audience, the image of the 1950s American housewife is often presented as one of ease. She is shown in advertisements standing beside a gleaming refrigerator, smiling over a spotless counter, dressed with a degree of care that now seems almost theatrical for ordinary domestic life. The visual language of the decade suggests comfort, stability, and abundance. Yet beneath that polished surface was a quieter and more complicated reality, one that helps explain why sedatives, stimulants, and so-called nerve medicines became such a familiar part of daily existence for many women. The pills were not simply a matter of personal weakness, nor were they merely the result of fashionable overprescribing in the abstract. They belonged to a much larger system of expectations, pressures, and contradictions that shaped women's lives in post-war America. One of the first things worth understanding is that the 1950s were not experienced as restful by everyone who lived through them. For millions of American families, the decade brought important material improvements. There were more consumer goods, more access to home ownership, and for many white middle-class families in particular, a powerful sense of upward movement. But material comfort did not necessarily produce emotional freedom. In fact, in some households it produced a new kind of strain. The suburban ideal required maintenance, and not just of lawns, appliances, and children, but of mood, image, and social performance. A woman was often expected not only to run a home efficiently, but to do so with warmth, elegance, patience, and visible gratitude. Domestic labor, which had always been demanding, was now wrapped in a cultural script that insisted it should look effortless. That difference matters. Hard work can be endured more honestly when it is acknowledged as hard. But when labor is framed as a privilege, when exhaustion must be disguised as feminine poise, and when frustration itself begins to feel like a moral failure, strain takes on a different shape. In that world, pills could appear not as a dramatic escape, but as a practical tool. They promised calm without rebellion, energy without complaint, sleep without reflection. They fit neatly into a society that often preferred private chemical adjustment to open social questioning. Part of the discomfort came from the narrowness of the role itself. During the Second World War, many American women had entered factories, offices, and public life in ways that altered their sense of what adulthood might include. Wartime necessity had made women's labor visibly valuable. But after the war, the national mood shifted. Men returned home. The culture began to emphasize domestic stability. Popular media, advertisers, advice columnists, clergy, educators, and politicians all contributed in different ways to a renewed ideal of feminine fulfillment through marriage, motherhood, and home management. This did not mean all women obediently accepted such messages in the same way, nor that all women had the same opportunities to do so. But the pressure was real, and it was repeated everywhere. For a woman who felt bored, angry, lonely, intellectually starved, sexually dissatisfied, or quietly trapped, there were few respectable languages available for those feelings. To describe such dissatisfaction openly risked sounding ungrateful, unstable, selfish, or somehow unfeminine. It is here that the history becomes especially revealing. because the medical language of the time often translated social distress into personal nerves. If a woman felt overwhelmed by child-rearing, isolated in a new suburb, exhausted by household demands, disappointed in marriage, or flattened by routine, her problem might be interpreted not as evidence that something in her world needed changing, but as a sign that she herself needed calming, correcting, or strengthening. Doctors occupied an important place in this process. Many physicians of the period were neither cartoon villains nor simple dupes of the pharmaceutical industry. Most worked within the assumptions of their time. They saw women presenting with fatigue, headaches, irritability, insomnia, low mood, digestive troubles, and anxiety. These symptoms were real, but the framework through which they were interpreted often remained deeply shaped by gender expectations. Women were frequently understood as more nervous, more fragile, more hormonally unstable, or more emotionally delicate than men. Such assumptions had a long history, and by the 1950s they remained deeply embedded in both formal medicine and popular culture. That meant a woman who came to a doctor with an impossible life might leave with a manageable prescription. Sedatives and tranquilizers seemed modern, scientific, and respectable. They could be folded into ordinary middle-class life far more discreetly than alcohol abuse or emotional collapse. A pill bottle in a bathroom cabinet did not shatter the image of the orderly family. In some cases, it actually protected it. The woman could continue to host guests, prepare meals, attend church, supervise homework, smile at neighbors, and preserve the appearance of domestic composure. The medicine did not solve the contradictions in her life, but it allowed her, at least temporarily, to remain functional inside them. There was also the matter of isolation, which is easy to underestimate if one only remembers the decade through its bright visual symbols. The suburban home could be comfortable, but it could also be physically and psychologically enclosing. In older urban neighborhoods or in rural communities, daily life often brought more incidental contact across generations and households. Postwar suburbs, by contrast, were frequently designed around the nuclear family, the automobile, and a sharp separation between public work and private home. A husband might leave early, commute to work, and spend the day among colleagues. A woman with small children might spend long hours in repetitive domestic routines with little adult companionship. The loneliness of that arrangement was not always dramatic enough to attract attention, but it could accumulate quietly, day after day. This was especially true for mothers of young children. Popular nostalgia sometimes softens the reality of full-time motherhood in an era before many of the conveniences later generations take for granted. Washing machines and vacuum cleaners existed, certainly, but household expectations expanded along with them. Cleanliness standards rose. Meals were expected to be regular and presentable. Clothing still required care. Child supervision was constant. And crucially, the ideal mother was not merely competent. She was patient, cheerful, emotionally available, sexually appealing to her husband, attentive to children, socially polished, and deeply invested in the home as a moral center. That was an enormous number of roles to perform inside a single day. There is a revealing irony here. The decade is often imagined as a triumph of domestic technology, and in some ways it was. But appliances did not simply remove labor. They also helped raise the standard for what counted as acceptable domestic life. A cleaner home became the norm, not the exception. Better food storage did not necessarily reduce meal responsibility. It could expand it. Convenience sometimes changed the form of work rather than freeing women from it. And because this was taking place in a culture of comparison, where magazines and advertisements displayed impossibly polished homes, many women were measuring their private fatigue against a public fantasy of graceful domestic mastery. If they failed to feel fulfilled by this arrangement, the failure was often individualized. This is one of the most important misunderstandings modern viewers bring to the topic. It is tempting to imagine that everyone simply knew the housewife ideal was restrictive and false, and that women therefore took pills in conscious rebellion or despair. But many women genuinely invested in the role. They wanted good marriages, healthy children, beautiful homes, and stable family life. The pain came partly from wanting those things and still finding the role exhausting, narrowing, or emotionally insufficient. That made the distress harder to name. It is easier to resist a role one rejects entirely than a role one partly values and partly resents. The language of nerves offered a way to describe suffering without directly challenging the social order. A woman was not necessarily saying, or even thinking, that the structure of suburban domesticity was too confining. She might simply say she felt run down, tense, low, unable to sleep, unable to cope, on edge. Those complaints were legible. They fit medical categories. They could be treated. But the treatment often aimed at adaptation rather than transformation. The goal was not to ask whether the conditions of her life were humane, intellectually sustaining, or fairly distributed. The goal was to help her continue. And so a pharmaceutical culture flourished in the spaces between discomfort and silence. Some women were prescribed barbiturates to sleep. Others received amphetamines to increase energy or suppress appetite. Later, tranquilizers would be marketed more aggressively and more famously, but even before the peak of tranquilizer culture in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the pattern was already visible. Women were being medically equipped to remain composed in roles that demanded relentless composure. The substances varied, and so did their effects, but the larger logic remained strikingly consistent. There was another layer as well, one that involved appearance. The pressure to remain slim, presentable, and attractive did not disappear after marriage. In many ways it intensified. The successful housewife was expected to reflect well on the household. She was part hostess, part mother, part manager, part symbol of family success. Diet, pills, and stimulants entered this world not only through medicine but through beauty culture. Weight gain was treated as a personal failure. Tiredness was a threat to femininity. If a woman felt dull, heavy, or worn down, pills promised restoration. They suggested that modern science could make her equal to the demands placed upon her. But of course, chemical assistance often carried its own costs. Sedatives could dull more than anxiety. Stimulants could fray the nerves they were meant to support. Dependency, though not always named as such, could grow quietly. Some women likely experienced real relief. Others found themselves caught in cycles of exhaustion and sedation, waking and calming, striving and collapsing. The promise of balance could become its opposite. Yet, because the broader social script remained intact, the individual woman might interpret the worsening pattern as yet another sign that she herself was failing to manage properly. This is one reason the subject still feels so unsettling. The pills were not always given at the edge of catastrophe. They often entered ordinary life through normal channels, respectable channels, even loving channels. A husband might encourage his wife to see a doctor because he was worried. A physician might prescribe medication because he genuinely believed it would help. A woman might accept it because she wanted to be well, to be patient with her children, to stop crying unexpectedly, to sleep through the night, to steady herself before guests arrived, to feel less frightened by the shapeless weight of another identical day. There is no need to flatten this into a simple morality tale. Its real historical force lies in how reasonable it could appear from inside the system. And yet, the reasonableness itself is what invites deeper scrutiny. Why did so many women need private chemical help to sustain a life that public culture insisted was natural and fulfilling? Why did a society so proud of its abundance produce such widespread quiet distress? Those questions begin to move us beyond the image of the pill bottle and toward the architecture of the decade itself. Its gendered labor, its emotional discipline, its medical assumptions, and its devotion to appearances. The answer was not the same for every woman. Class mattered enormously. Race mattered enormously. A middle-class white suburban housewife occupied a very different social world from a black woman working for wages while also carrying domestic burdens at home, or from a poor woman with little access to respectable medical care at all. The polished housewife ideal was never universally attainable, even as it was presented as universally desirable. But that ideal still exerted cultural pressure far beyond the households that most closely resembled it. It shaped aspirations, judgments, and definitions of normal womanhood throughout the decade. That wider pressure meant that even women who did not live in a glossy suburban ranch house could feel measured against its standards. And the standards were demanding not only in practice but in spirit. A woman was expected to be emotionally stabilizing for others. She was the atmosphere of the home. If the household felt calm, she had succeeded. If it felt strained, she could easily absorb the blame. It is difficult to overstate what a heavy burden that was, especially in a culture that offered limited sympathy for women who openly admitted resentment or depletion. The deeper we look, the more the pills begin to seem less like an odd side note and more like a clue. They point us toward a world in which domestic femininity was treated as both sacred and strangely fragile, endlessly praised and constantly managed. They point us toward a medical culture willing to soothe women without always fully hearing them. And they point us toward a national mythology that preferred serenity on the surface, even when that serenity had to be pharmacologically supported behind the scenes. To understand why so many pills entered so many kitchens, bedrooms, and handbags, we need to move further into the machinery of post-war domestic life itself, into the architecture of the suburban home, the rhythms of housework, the psychology of ideal motherhood, and the quiet tension between private unhappiness and public gratitude. Because once we do, the question changes. It is no longer simply why women took so many pills. It becomes why the decade made those pills feel, to so many, like part of the job. Because once we do, the question changes. It is no longer simply why women took so many pills. It becomes why the decade made those pills feel, to so many, like part of the job. In practical terms, that job began before breakfast and rarely ended when the day was over. The idealized American home of the 1950s was often presented as a site of leisure, but in daily life it operated more like a carefully managed workplace without wages, weekends, or clear boundaries. The housewife was expected to be scheduler, cleaner, cook, shopper, bookkeeper, childminder, nurse, hostess, and emotional regulator, all while preserving the impression that none of this was especially difficult. If the family was fed on time, the children were tidy, the husband's shirts were pressed, the kitchen remained presentable, and the home seemed welcoming rather than strained, then the system appeared to be working. If any of those elements slipped, the fault was often understood as personal rather than structural. That helps explain why the burden could feel so intimate. A woman was not merely failing at a task if she felt overwhelmed. She could feel she was failing at womanhood itself, at marriage, at motherhood, at adulthood in the form her culture most clearly praised. The domestic ideal of the period was not limited to chores, contained a moral atmosphere. A good housewife did not simply do the washing. She cared enough to do it properly. She did not merely prepare dinner. She made home feel stable through dinner. She did not merely watch children. She shaped their emotional world with patience and consistency. In that setting, fatigue became more than tiredness. It became a threat to identity. Even the layout of post-war life could sharpen the pressure. The suburban home offered privacy, but privacy is not always freedom. It can also mean fewer witnesses, fewer interruptions, and fewer natural sources of support. For many women, the day unfolded in a series of repeating actions that were both necessary and strangely invisible. Beds were made only to be unmade again. Floors were cleaned only to gather dust again. Meals were planned, purchased, cooked, served, cleared, and replaced by the need for the next meal. Children needed attention not in one dramatic emergency, but in hundreds of small, relentless ways. Laundry appeared to multiply. Bathrooms required upkeep. Guests might arrive with little warning. Church, school, neighborhood visits, and family obligations added another layer of social labor that could not be neatly separated from the private labor of the home. And unlike many forms of paid work, domestic work offered very little recognized completion. There was no clocking out, no promotion, no salary increase, no official recognition that a difficult week had been survived. A woman could spend an entire day working and still be asked, implicitly or explicitly, what she had done with her time. That question hovered over the era in subtle ways. The home was considered her sphere, but because it was familiar and feminized, its difficulty was often minimized. Labor that was naturalized as feminine was easily overlooked as labor at all. This is one reason the language of convenience in 1950s advertising feels so revealing when read carefully. So many products were marketed as devices that would make domestic life easier, quicker, smoother, brighter, or more modern. But the tone of those advertisements often betrayed an anxiety underneath the promise. They assumed a woman who needed help, but they rarely honored her labor openly. Instead, they told her she could achieve the ideal more efficiently. The standard itself remained in place. If a better vacuum cleaner, a frozen dinner option, a new detergent, or an improved washing machine shortened one task, the save time did not necessarily become personal freedom. It could simply be absorbed by rising expectations elsewhere. Clean houses became cleaner. Meals became more varied. Children became more supervised. Personal appearance remained part of the assignment. The emphasis on appearance was not superficial in the trivial sense. It was structural. To appear calm was part of the social duty. Neighbors noticed. Family noticed. Church communities noticed. Husbands noticed. Children learned the emotional weather of the home through their mother's visible composure. A woman who looked tired, disorganized, or irritable risked more than private discomfort. She risked social judgment. In a decade so invested in respectability, that judgment mattered. Respectability was tied to class ambition, to family reputation, and to the belief that America's domestic order reflected national health after years of depression and war. A stable home was not merely private success. It had become part of a broader cultural story about what the country believed it was becoming. That wider national story is easy to miss if one looks only at medicine. But it sits quietly in the background of the pill bottle. The 1950s were years of Cold War anxiety, anti-communist politics, and intense emphasis on conformity. Stability was treated as virtue. Disorder, whether political, sexual, emotional, or social, could seem suspicious. The ideal family was imagined as a defense against chaos. In that climate, a cheerful and capable housewife was not just a domestic figure. She was part of the symbolic architecture of American normality. Her emotional steadiness helped reassure the culture that private life was intact. The irony, of course, is that this political and cultural investment in domestic order could make private unhappiness harder to express. A woman who felt trapped or bleak inside a supposedly ideal household was not merely contradicting her own role. She was brushing against one of the decade's most cherished myths. It was often easier and safer to translate distress into symptoms than into criticism. Headaches, nerves, sleeplessness, tension, digestive trouble, fatigue, low appetite or too much appetite, a vague inability to cope. These were acceptable forms of complaint. They did not openly threaten the social script. They allowed suffering to remain legible as illness rather than dissent. Doctors, in that sense, were often meeting women at the point where social expectation had already been filtered into bodily language. A woman might not say, even to herself, that she resented the confinement of domestic life, feared the repetition of her days, or felt lonely in her own marriage. She might say she was exhausted all the time, that her heart raced, that she felt weak, that she cried too easily, that she could not sleep, that her stomach was never right, that she lacked energy, that the children wore her down, that she felt shaky by afternoon. These were real bodily experiences, but they were also expressions shaped by a world in which emotional strain often had to arrive disguised. Medical treatment did not invent that disguise, but it often reinforced it. Physicians of the period inherited older traditions that linked women's distress to temperament, hormones, reproductive cycles, nerves, and constitutional delicacy. Such ideas did not require cruelty to be harmful. They simply organized perception. A husband under pressure at work might be seen as burdened by circumstance. A wife under pressure at home might be seen as unwell in herself. That distinction did not apply in every case, but it ran deeply enough through the culture to influence everyday medical encounters. There was also a practical feature of the doctor-patient relationship that made prescription solutions especially likely. Time was limited. Social change was slow. Counseling, where available, was not always accessible, affordable, or culturally acceptable. Many doctors had few tools that seemed both respectable and immediate. A sedative could be offered during a brief appointment. An amphetamine could be prescribed to combat fatigue or low mood, or to help with weight control. A barbiturate could help with sleep. A tonic effect could be promised. The woman could leave with something in hand, something that signaled action had been taken. In a medical culture that valued intervention, the prescription pad offered clarity. Yet the clarity could be deceptive. A pill could produce a sensation of improvement without addressing the conditions that generated the suffering. Sometimes that was enough, at least temporarily. Many people in all eras use medication to endure lives that cannot be reorganized overnight. But the historical question is not whether relief was ever real. It is why so much relief had to be sought in chemical form within a social arrangement so publicly celebrated as fulfilling. That is where the subject becomes less about pathology and more about adaptation. Some of the most revealing cases involved not women at the edge of breakdown, but women who appeared outwardly successful. The polished suburban mother with a neat hairstyle, courteous manners, healthy children, and a respectable husband could still feel a persistent hollowness difficult to name. She might not have wanted to abandon her family. She might not even have wanted a radically different life. What she wanted, perhaps, was rest, adult companionship, room for thought, acknowledgement of her labor, relief from constant scrutiny, or freedom from the burden of being everyone else's stabilizing presence. These wants did not fit neatly into a culture that treated maternal self-sacrifice as normal and feminine fulfillment as almost self-evident. One of the quieter cruelties of the decade was that women were often asked to carry contradiction without language for it. They were told they were central to the home, yet their work was undervalued. They were told they were fulfilled, yet many felt diminished. They were encouraged to be modern, efficient, and attractive, yet also modest, selfless, and domestic. They were asked to care deeply about appearance but not appear vain, to be desirable but respectable, to be attentive mothers but still sexually available wives, to make home life smooth without letting their own needs become disruptive. Each individual expectation could sound manageable. Their accumulation was something else. This accumulation helps explain the peculiar mix of stimulants and sedatives that entered women's lives. The same culture could ask a woman to be more energetic and more tranquil at once. She needed pep to get through the day, slimness to remain appealing, patience with children, cheer in company, and calm enough to avoid visible strain. A stimulant in the morning and a sedative in the evening could begin to look less like a contradiction than like a chemical reflection of the role itself. The role demanded impossible elasticity. The medicine tried imperfectly to provide it. Weight control was especially important in this picture because it joined medicine to beauty and discipline. Amphetamines were sometimes prescribed not only for mood or fatigue, but for appetite suppression. Thinness was associated with self-command, attractiveness, and modern femininity. A woman already depleted by domestic labor could now be chemically driven toward more energy while eating less, all in the name of maintaining the appropriate version of herself. The result could be a body further strained by the very means meant to keep it socially acceptable. At the same time, alcohol remained part of some households, and in certain cases it intersected with prescription use in dangerous ways. But pills retained a particular social legitimacy. They were medical, they were clean, measured, and private. They suggested guidance rather than indulgence. A woman taking what her doctor prescribed could still regard herself and be regarded as responsible. This mattered in a culture where female respectability was closely guarded. One did not need to stumble publicly or confess openly. One could simply take something for the nerves. Popular media, too, played a role in normalizing the vocabulary of strain. Advice columns, women's magazines, and advertisements often acknowledged fatigue and tension, but in ways that redirected them back into the domestic framework. A tired mother was not necessarily invited to question the distribution of labor in the household. She was invited to restore herself so she could continue. A worried wife was not always encouraged to ask what in her environment was producing such anxiety. She was encouraged to recover poise. Even when emotional suffering was sympathetically described, the horizon of acceptable solutions remained narrow. This narrowing could be especially painful for educated women whose ambitions had not vanished simply because the culture preferred not to recognize them. Many had gone to college not merely to decorate their marriage prospects, but because they were genuinely curious, capable, and intellectually alive. Yet post-war domestic ideology often steered such capacities back toward home management, volunteer work, tasteful conversation, and properly raised children. None of those things were trivial, but for some women, the compression of adult intelligence into a highly managed domestic identity produced a quiet erosion that medicine could soothe without naming. There is a tendency, in retrospect, to speak of the problem with no name as if it emerged all at once in the early 1960s. In truth, the emotional terrain it described had been forming for years. By the 1950s, long before it would be more openly articulated in public discourse, many women were already living inside its early outlines. They felt something was wrong, but the wrongness was hard to locate because it sat at the intersection of love, duty, comfort, dependence, boredom, aspiration, and social pressure. Pills offered one way to keep functioning while the contradiction remained unresolved. And still, there were women who resisted this script in small ways, even when they did not name it as resistance. Some sought part-time work. Some leaned heavily on female friendships. Some became intensely involved in clubs, school organizations, church groups, reading circles, or volunteer networks, partly because these offered adult conversation and a reason to step beyond the walls of the home. Some poured their intelligence into local activism long before they would have described themselves as political. These choices mattered because they suggest that what many women needed was not merely sedation or stimulation, but a broader life. The more closely we look, the clearer it becomes that the pills were only one strand in a larger network of adaptation. They sat alongside gossip shared over coffee, private tears in bathrooms, tense silences at dinner, perfectionist cleaning, overcommitment to children's schedules, dutiful hosting, careful grooming, church attendance, bridge clubs, shopping trips, and doctor visits where vague distress had to be translated into something clinically receivable. Every one of those behaviors could be perfectly ordinary. What makes them historically significant is the way they formed a pattern around a role that demanded more composure than many human beings could naturally sustain. This is also where marriage enters the story more directly, because the emotional economy of the 1950s household did not rest on women alone by accident. Husbands were typically positioned as breadwinners whose paid labor justified their centrality, even when the comfort of that breadwinning role depended heavily on invisible labor at home. Many men loved their wives, worried about them, and wanted to provide. But affection did not automatically produce equality of understanding. A husband who left for the office each morning might genuinely believe his wife lived the more sheltered life. He might see the house, the children, the meals, and the consumer comforts, and conclude that she was fortunate. He might not see the monotony, the emotional fragmentation, the scrutiny, or the way the home could feel both full and isolating at once. That gap in understanding could itself become another source of pressure. If a woman tried to explain her exhaustion and was met not with cruelty but with bewilderment, the isolation only deepened. She was not merely tired. She was becoming difficult to interpret within the logic of the very family she was supposed to anchor. In that moment, the doctor's office and the prescription bottle offered not just treatment, but validation of a limited kind. They confirmed that something was wrong, even if they named the wrong thing. And as the decade moved forward, the pharmaceutical dimension of this world would not diminish. It would become more visible, more marketed, and in some respects more culturally refined. The language would shift. New drugs would enter the scene. The image of the tranquilized suburban woman would become sharper, more recognizable, and eventually harder for the culture to ignore. But before that later visibility arrived, the groundwork was already being laid in the quiet routines of post-war domestic life, where exhaustion had to be prettied up, where unhappiness had to be softened into symptoms, and where relief increasingly came in small, medically sanctioned doses that fit neatly into a handbag or a bedside drawer. To understand how that transformation gathered force, we have to move next into the doctor's offices, the advertisements, and the pharmaceutical promises that began turning ordinary female distress into one of the most marketable medical conditions of the modern American household. To understand how that transformation gathered force, we have to move next into the doctor's offices, the advertisements, and the pharmaceutical promises that began turning ordinary female distress into one of the most marketable medical conditions of the modern American household. The doctor's office in 1950s America occupied a particular kind of authority. For many middle-class families, especially in the growing suburbs, the family physician was not simply a technician of illness. He was often treated as a steady interpreter of normal life itself. He advised on children, nerves, digestion, marriage strain, fatigue, menopause, sleep, and the vague unease that did not fit neatly into a single diagnosis. His reassurance carried moral weight. If he said a woman was overworked, that meant something. If he said she needed rest, that became legitimate. And if he handed her a prescription, it often arrived not as an indulgence, but as a respectable medical response to respectable suffering. This authority mattered because women were frequently navigating distress that did not present as obvious crisis. They were not always collapsing dramatically. Many were simply functioning badly in a role that required constant functioning. They arrived with headaches that lingered for months, with sleeplessness that made mornings feel impossible, with exhaustion that no amount of coffee seemed to solve, with sudden tears they could not explain, with irritability that made them feel guilty around their children, with a sense of panic that arrived for no visible reason while folding laundry or standing in a grocery store. These were not spectacular symptoms. They were ordinary enough to be dismissed and painful enough to become life-shaping. The physician, standing between domestic life and medical legitimacy, often translated these experiences into the language available to him. Nerves was one of the most common words. It was broad, flexible, and socially useful. It could describe anxiety without demanding deep psychological excavation. It could explain fatigue without openly criticizing marriage or motherhood. It could frame distress as temporary imbalance rather than structural dissatisfaction. A woman with nerves was ill enough to deserve treatment, but not so ill that the family order itself had to be questioned. There is something important in how vague that word was. Vagueness protected everyone. It allowed discomfort to be acknowledged without becoming socially dangerous. If a woman said she was unhappy in marriage, the conversation became morally complicated. If she said her nerves were bad, the path forward seemed cleaner. She could be helped. She could be calmed. Her suffering remained personal, manageable, and medically respectable. Pharmaceutical companies understood this terrain extremely well. By the mid-20th century, they were not merely selling medicines. They were selling emotional solutions that fit neatly inside cultural expectations. Advertisements aimed at physicians often presented women in states of visible strain. Anxious mothers, tired wives, overwhelmed homemakers, women sitting at kitchen tables looking pale and worried while children pulled at their sleeves. The promise was rarely radical happiness. It was restoration of normality. The medicine would help her become herself again, meaning the version of herself most useful to the domestic order around her. This framing is worth pausing on. The goal was not liberation. It was adjustment. A woman was not encouraged to ask whether her life should be reorganized. She was invited to become more comfortable inside its existing structure. If she felt resentful, the issue was not the unfairness of the burden but the discomfort of resentment itself. If she felt exhausted, the problem was not the endlessness of domestic labor, but her inability to sustain it gracefully. Medication was offered as a bridge back to proper functioning. Some of the advertisements were strikingly direct. Doctors were shown images of smiling wives restored to cheerful motherhood after pharmaceutical intervention. A sedative might promise calm for the tense housewife. A stimulant might promise renewed efficiency and brightness for the fatigued one. Even the visual contrast told a story. Before treatment, she looked withdrawn, anxious, unkempt. After treatment, she was once again attractive, organized, emotionally available. The medicine did not merely improve symptoms. It restored femininity itself. This was particularly true with the rise of tranquilizers. Before the word became culturally famous, sedatives such as barbiturates had already been widely used, but newer medications arrived with the language of modern refinement. They sounded cleaner, safer, more scientific. They were presented not as heavy interventions for the seriously ill, but as elegant solutions for ordinary stress. Tension, worry, insomnia, emotional instability. These were increasingly medicalized in ways that aligned perfectly with the emotional demands placed on women. And the marketing was often aimed as much at doctors as at patients. Pharmaceutical representatives visited practices, distributed literature, sponsored professional education, and helped shape what counted as common, treatable conditions. The postwar physician was working in an environment where new medications were framed as signs of medical progress. To prescribe was not necessarily seen as overreach. It could feel like responsible modern care. At the same time, doctors were not operating in a vacuum. Many genuinely believed they were helping women whose suffering was obvious. A mother who had not slept properly for months, who was anxious and losing weight, who cried unpredictably and felt unable to cope, did need help. The problem was not always that medicine responded. It was often that the response stopped at symptom management and rarely asked why so many women in the same social role were arriving with the same complaints. There was also the issue of confidentiality and safety. For some women, the doctor's office may have been the only semi-private place where distress could be admitted without immediate family judgment. Speaking honestly to a husband was not always easy. Speaking honestly to neighbors could be socially dangerous. But a physician could hear complaints that would sound shameful elsewhere. The prescription, in that sense, was not only treatment but a socially acceptable container for pain. It allowed a woman to say, even to herself, that she was under medical care rather than simply failing. One should also remember that psychiatry and therapy carried different meanings in that era. To see a psychiatrist could feel far more serious, more stigmatized, and more socially risky than receiving medication from a family doctor. Prescription could remain ordinary. It did not necessarily threaten one's identity as a normal wife and mother. It could be folded into everyday life almost invisibly. The invisibility was part of its power. A pill could be taken in the morning before children woke, or in the afternoon before guests arrived, or at night before bed. It did not require public explanation. To fit into drawers, purses, medicine cabinets. It left no dramatic evidence. This privacy mattered in a culture where female emotional instability could quickly become gossip or moral judgment. Quiet suffering paired naturally with quiet medication. The same was true for stimulants, though their social function was slightly different. If tranquilizers helped produce calm, stimulants promised performance. They were prescribed for fatigue, low mood, and often for weight control. Thinness, especially in middle-class white femininity, was tied closely to discipline and attractiveness. A woman who had children was still expected to remain visually appealing, not only for herself but as part of marital and social respectability. Fatigue and weight gain could both be interpreted as signs of letting oneself go. Amphetamines offered a medically sanctioned way to resist both. This created a strange and revealing cycle. The same woman might be chemically encouraged to eat less, move faster, smile more, sleep better, and remain calmer, all while managing a household that gave her little genuine rest. The medicine mirrored the contradiction of the role itself. She was expected to be endlessly available yet never visibly depleted. Her body had to be disciplined into performing emotional stability. There is a subtle cruelty in that phrase, emotional stability. Sounds benign, even admirable. But in the domestic culture of the 1950s, it often meant that women were responsible for absorbing discomfort so that others could experience order. If children were frightened, she soothed them. If a husband came home tired, she softened the transition. If guests arrived, she created warmth. If tension existed, she was expected to manage its atmosphere. Her emotions were not fully private. They were part of household infrastructure. That expectation helps explain why pills could become emotionally symbolic. They were not simply chemicals. They were tools for maintaining the emotional climate others depended on. A woman might take a sedative not because she wanted pleasure, but because she did not want to snap at her children, or because she feared crying in front of company, or because she wanted to be patient when she no longer felt patient. In that sense, the medicine was often tied to care. It was not selfish. It was sacrificial. This makes simplistic judgment historically unhelpful. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine women as passive victims of overprescribing or foolish consumers of pharmaceutical culture. But many were making rational choices inside narrow constraints. If your life does not allow real rest, artificial calm can feel like responsibility. If your identity depends on holding a household together, chemical support may look less like dependence and more like duty. At the same time, not all prescriptions were benign. Barbiturates, for example, carried serious risks of dependence and overdose. Dosages were not always carefully managed by modern standards. Women could move from occasional use into habitual reliance almost without noticing the transition. A pill first taken for temporary strain could become part of the permanent architecture of the day. Sleep without it felt impossible. Calm without it felt unreachable. The line between treatment and dependence blurred slowly enough to remain socially invisible. And because the suffering being treated was often chronic rather than temporary, the prescription itself could become chronic. If the real issue was structural loneliness, unequal labor, intellectual starvation, or emotional isolation, then no short course of medication could resolve it. Relief might come, but the conditions returned every morning with the breakfast dishes and the school schedules and the quiet suburban afternoons. The medicine had to keep returning too. It is here that women's magazines become especially revealing. Publications aimed at housewives often balanced contradictory messages with remarkable precision. They acknowledged fatigue while celebrating domestic fulfillment. They sympathized with anxiety while reinforcing the ideal of cheerful motherhood. They offered beauty tips, recipes, marriage advice, child-rearing guidance, and articles on nerves in the same issue, as though all belonged naturally to one emotional landscape. And in a sense, they did. The magazines were not inventing contradiction. They were organizing it into a lifestyle. A reader might encounter an article encouraging patience with children, beside an advertisement for a sedative that promised relief from tension. She might see advice on preserving romance in marriage beside appetite-suppressant ads aimed at helping her remain slim and desirable. The message was consistent even when unstated. If you are struggling, the goal is not to question the structure. The goal is to become better at inhabiting it. Even language around menopause and menstruation could be pulled into this broader system. Hormonal explanations were often used to medicalize female distress in ways that reduced complex emotional lives to biological instability. Sometimes this offered sympathy. Often it also offered dismissal. A woman's frustration could be interpreted as chemistry rather than circumstance. Again, medication followed naturally from that assumption. If the problem lived in her body, the solution would too. Yet beneath all this, something quieter was beginning to shift. Women were talking to one another, even if not always in overtly political terms. In kitchens, over coffee, during school pickup, at church functions, in whispered phone calls after children were asleep, there were small recognitions. Someone else was tired too. Someone else cried for no obvious reason. Someone else felt guilty for not being happier. Someone else loved her family and still felt strangely absent inside her own life. These were not yet movements. They were recognitions. But recognitions matter. They weaken the isolation that keeps suffering private. They introduce the possibility that the problem is shared rather than purely personal. And once enough women begin quietly noticing the same contradiction, the language of nerves starts to feel less complete. For the moment, though, the dominant system still held. Doctors prescribed. Advertisements reassured. Husbands often misunderstood. Neighbors maintained appearances. Children absorbed the emotional weather of homes they would later remember as either calm or tense without always knowing why. And women kept moving through days structured around service, beauty, patience, and performance, assisted more and more often by chemistry. The pharmaceutical industry did not create the dissatisfaction of 1950s domestic life, but it became extraordinarily skilled at packaging relief for it. It found profit in the gap between the ideal and the lived reality. It offered solutions that were intimate, respectable, and endlessly renewable. And as the decade approached its later years, one particular kind of medicine, the tranquilizer, would begin to define that relationship so clearly that it would become almost a cultural symbol. Before that happened, however, another pressure was quietly tightening inside the same households. The expectation that a woman's happiness should come almost entirely from motherhood itself, and that if it did not, the fault must somehow belong to her. Motherhood in 1950s America was not simply treated as an important part of adult life. It was increasingly presented as the emotional center of ideal womanhood, the place where purpose, morality, femininity, and national stability were all supposed to meet. To be a good mother was not merely to keep children safe and fed. It was to shape the future of the country through the atmosphere of the home. This gave motherhood extraordinary symbolic value, but it also made it dangerously difficult to discuss honestly. If motherhood was framed as a woman's deepest natural fulfillment, then any ambivalence toward it could feel like a confession of moral failure. This is where many women found themselves trapped between love and silence. Most mothers loved their children. That is precisely what made the emotional strain harder to speak about. Loving one's children did not erase exhaustion, boredom, resentment, loneliness, or the grief of a shrinking adult identity. But the culture often treated those feelings as if they should cancel one another out. If a woman had healthy children and a stable home, why would she feel restless? If she was fortunate enough to stay home, why would she feel trapped? If motherhood was supposed to be the highest expression of femininity, why did some afternoons feel like a kind of invisible suffocation? These questions were not easily spoken aloud. Even private thought could feel disloyal. A mother who found herself crying in the bathroom while children played in the next room was not necessarily rejecting family life. She was often confronting the unsettling gap between what she had been promised and what daily experience actually felt like. She had been told that domestic life would feel meaningful, and often parts of it did. But meaning does not cancel repetition. Love does not eliminate monotony. Gratitude does not erase fatigue. One of the most powerful cultural messages of the period was that a woman should be enough for her children in almost every emotional sense. Good motherhood required presence, patience, consistency, and deep personal investment. Child development theories were becoming more influential in mainstream life, and with them came a heightened sense that early maternal behavior shaped the entire psychological future of the child. This could be helpful in encouraging emotional attentiveness, but it also placed extraordinary pressure on mothers. If a child struggled, the mother could easily feel responsible not only for practical care, but for the architecture of the child's inner life. That kind of responsibility does not end when the dishes are done. It lingers in every tone of voice, every moment of irritation, every rushed goodbye, every bedtime story told with less patience than intended. Many women lived with the quiet fear that ordinary frustration might damage the people they loved most. A sedative in that context could feel like a form of protection. It was not simply about calming oneself. It was about becoming the mother one believed one ought to be. This helps explain why emotional exhaustion often remained hidden behind competence. A woman could be doing everything correctly by visible standards and still feel internally frayed. The children were clean. School lunches were packed. Birthday parties were organized. Christmas cards were mailed. Illnesses were managed. Guests were welcomed. But inside that competence could live an intense sense of disappearing. Many women described, even if only privately, the strange feeling of being constantly needed and yet increasingly difficult to locate as a person separate from those needs. The suburban home intensified this feeling because it often organized life around children's rhythms. School schedules, pediatric appointments, neighborhood friendships, church activities, shopping routines, after-school obligations, all of it pulled attention outward toward management and care. There was little cultural permission for a mother to say she wanted solitude, intellectual challenge, professional recognition, or simply hours of adult conversation that were not organized around children. Those desires could sound selfish when placed beside the sacred language of maternal devotion. And yet children themselves were not the source of the problem. The issue was the narrowing of acceptable identity. A woman could be a devoted mother and still need more than motherhood. But the public script often left little room for that distinction. It suggested that if domestic life did not feel sufficient, the deficiency must lie in the woman rather than in the cultural imagination surrounding her. This is why guilt became such a central emotional feature of the decade. Guilt for impatience, guilt for boredom, guilt for wanting time alone, guilt for missing work outside the home, guilt for resenting a husband who seemed freer, guilt for feeling depressed in a life that looked enviable from the outside, guilt for not being grateful enough. Guilt, importantly, is highly compatible with pharmaceutical treatment. A guilty person is less likely to challenge the structure producing the guilt. She is more likely to conclude that she needs fixing. Doctors often encountered women precisely at this intersection of exhaustion and guilt. A mother might not arrive saying, "I need a life larger than this." She might arrive saying she was tired all the time, that she snapped at the children, that she felt ashamed of her irritability, that she could not sleep because her mind raced at night over small failures of the day. The complaint sounded medical because it had become bodily. The body often carries what the social world makes difficult to say directly. It is also worth noticing how frequently the language of motherhood was tied to self-erasure as virtue. Popular advice praised women who put everyone else first. Sacrifice was not simply expected. It was admired. To rest too much, to protect personal time too firmly, or to insist on intellectual independence could be interpreted as selfishness rather than balance. The ideal mother anticipated needs before they were spoken and absorbed inconvenience without visible complaint. This kind of moral expectation made boundaries difficult to defend. If one's goodness is measured partly by selflessness, then saying, "I cannot do more" feels like a character flaw. This moral structure shaped marriage as well. Many husbands were not cruel or indifferent. They were often simply raised inside the same assumptions. They believed providing financially was the central proof of care. And because paid labor was visible, measurable, and publicly recognized, it was easier to defend as difficult. Domestic labor, by contrast, remained diffuse and repetitive. A husband could come home tired and feel justified in retreat. His wife, exhausted by a day without formal boundaries, might struggle to explain why her own fatigue felt equally real. This imbalance often created a peculiar emotional loneliness. A woman might be surrounded by family and still feel unseen in the precise place where she spent most of her life. She could be appreciated in general terms, a wonderful mother, a good wife, while the specific texture of her daily strain remained invisible. Praise in that form could become strangely hollow. It honored the role while missing the person inside it. Some women responded by pursuing perfection more intensely. If domestic life felt unstable internally, control over the visible details could offer reassurance. The house became cleaner, the meals more elaborate, the children's schedules more carefully managed, the personal grooming more exact. Perfectionism can look like discipline from the outside and anxiety from the inside. It often draws admiration precisely because it hides distress so effectively. Others withdrew emotionally while maintaining outward function. They did what needed to be done, but with a growing numbness that was difficult to explain. Here again, tranquilizers and sedatives fit naturally into the landscape. They did not need to create joy. They only needed to make the emotional flatness feel manageable enough to continue. A woman did not necessarily seek happiness from medication. She often sought steadiness. There is another irony here. The same culture that celebrated the stay-at-home mother also increasingly relied on expert advice to tell her how to mother correctly. Child psychologists, pediatricians, parenting manuals, magazine columns, radio programs all offered guidance. This could be genuinely useful, but it also implied that instinct alone was not enough. Motherhood was both idealized as natural and monitored as if it required constant correction. Women were expected to perform something supposedly innate with near-professional precision. That contradiction produced anxiety of its own. Was the baby sleeping correctly? Was discipline too strict or too soft? Was too much affection harmful? Was too little affection worse? Was ambition in children being encouraged properly? Was emotional security being built or accidentally damaged? These were not abstract questions. They entered kitchens and nurseries daily. For a woman already tired, the sense that every small decision might shape a child's future could be overwhelming. In that atmosphere, pills could begin to represent competence. If medication made one more patient, more energetic, less reactive, more able to maintain the ideal emotional climate of the home, then taking it could feel responsible rather than shameful. It aligned with the ethic of maternal duty. One did what was necessary for the family. The pharmaceutical industry, of course, recognized this moral framing. Advertisements increasingly suggested that treatment was not self-indulgence but family protection. A calmer mother meant happier children. A less anxious wife meant a more peaceful marriage. Emotional regulation became a service one provided to others, and medication became part of the toolkit of good domestic management. It is difficult to overstate how powerful that logic was. It transformed private suffering into another household responsibility. At the same time, not every woman accepted the role without resistance. Some mothers quietly insisted on pockets of independent life. They took college extension classes, joined reading groups, pursued volunteer leadership that was more intellectually demanding than it appeared, or fought to keep part-time professional work despite cultural skepticism. Some framed these choices as practical necessity, others as harmless hobbies, but beneath them was often a refusal to disappear completely into domestic function. Female friendship could be especially important here. Friendship offered something medicine could not: recognition without diagnosis. Another woman could understand the absurdity of spending an entire day working and being asked what one had accomplished. She could laugh at the pressure to look polished while handling sick children and endless laundry. She could admit, in private, that love and resentment sometimes lived side by side. These conversations did not always produce social revolution, but they softened isolation. They introduced the dangerous idea that one's private dissatisfaction might not be uniquely personal. That recognition would matter greatly in the years ahead. But during the 1950s, it often remained quiet, folded into ordinary social life rather than public language. The woman hosting coffee for neighbors might be the same woman privately wondering if she had vanished into her own kitchen. The mother praised for her devotion might be taking pills before guests arrived because she feared she could not manage the performance otherwise. The calm suburban street could contain enormous emotional, whether hidden behind curtains and polite conversation. This is why nostalgia for the decade can feel so selective. It remembers order and often forgets the labor required to maintain it. It remembers stable families and often misses the emotional discipline demanded inside them. It remembers polished mothers and forgets how many of them were privately medicated in order to remain polished. The pills were not an accidental side note to domestic life. They were woven into the attempt to preserve an image of domestic perfection that was far harder to live than to advertise. And nowhere was that image more aggressively reinforced than in the post-war suburban landscape itself. The lawns, the kitchens, the shopping centers, the school events, the dinner parties, the architecture of cheerful normality. If we want to understand why so many women felt both grateful and quietly suffocated, we have to step more fully into that world, where the house itself became both symbol and container, and where comfort could sometimes feel like another form of confinement. The post-war suburban home was one of the most powerful symbols of 1950s American success. It represented stability after depression, safety after war, and upward movement after years of uncertainty. A detached house with a small lawn, modern appliances, children in good schools, and a husband commuting to a respectable job became, for many families, the visible proof that life was progressing in the right direction. To own such a home was not simply to have shelter. It was to participate in a national promise. That promise mattered deeply because it was tied to memory. Many adults living through the 1950s had experienced the instability of the Great Depression or the disruptions of wartime separation. Scarcity and fear were still close enough to feel personal. Security was not taken for granted. A home of one's own, however modest, could feel almost sacred. It represented protection against chaos. It also represented adulthood in a very public way. The family home became evidence that one had done life correctly. For women, however, the emotional meaning of that home was more complicated. The same house that symbolized safety could also become the site of near-total responsibility. Every room carried expectation. The kitchen was not merely a place to cook. It was proof of competence. The living room was not merely a room. It was a stage for respectability. Children's bedrooms reflected maternal care. Bathrooms reflected discipline. Even the front lawn could become a small public referendum on household order. Suburban architecture intensified visibility in subtle ways. Neighbors were physically close, but emotional life remained highly private. Curtains opened onto streets where everyone recognized routines. Who left for work, whose children misbehaved, whose guests arrived too often, whose husband came home late, whose lawn looked neglected. These details became part of neighborhood knowledge. Social comparison did not require cruelty. It happened naturally through proximity and repetition. A woman might feel watched even when no one was actively watching. This constant low-level visibility encouraged performance. One dressed for errands. One kept the house ready enough for unexpected visitors. One maintained standards not only for personal satisfaction but because disorder felt socially exposed. Respectability was communal. A poorly managed home was not merely inconvenient. It could feel like a quiet public statement about character. The irony is that suburban life was often sold as freedom from the noise and pressure of urban existence. In practice, it could create a different kind of surveillance, softer, quieter, but persistent. The judgment came through comparison rather than formal authority. It lived in church conversations, school functions, neighborhood visits, and the subtle hierarchy of who seemed effortlessly successful and who seemed slightly off balance. Women often carried the emotional labor of that visibility. If the family was socially integrated, if neighbors felt welcomed, if holidays were well managed, if children behaved appropriately in public, much of that work had been done by the mother. Yet because the results appeared natural, the labor disappeared. Hospitality, for example, looked like personality when it was often planning, timing, expense, and emotional management layered together. Dinner parties were a small but telling example. Hosting could be pleasurable, but it was also a performance of class stability. The meal, the house, the children's behavior, the wife's appearance, the husband's ease, all communicated something about the family's place in the social world. A woman preparing for guests might spend an entire day cleaning, shopping, cooking, dressing children, managing her own appearance, and trying to ensure that the evening felt spontaneous and relaxed. If she took something for her nerves beforehand, it was not because the gathering was trivial. It was because it carried social meaning. The suburban house also reshaped time. Unlike paid work, which had beginnings and endings, domestic life expanded to fill available space. There was always one more drawer to organize, one more shirt to iron, one more errand to run, one more school notice to answer, one more social obligation to remember. Efficiency did not necessarily produce leisure because domestic perfection had no natural finish line. The better one performed, the more normal that level of performance became. This is where appliances become historically interesting again. The washing machine, the vacuum cleaner, the refrigerator, the electric stove, these were real improvements. They reduced certain forms of labor and changed household rhythms significantly. But they also created a paradox. Because life looked more modern, the labor inside it was often assumed to be lighter than it actually was. A woman with appliances was imagined as liberated, even while the standards for cleanliness and household management rose to meet those new possibilities. There was also an emotional isolation built into the suburban design itself. Husbands left for work, often by car, disappearing into a separate adult world of offices, conversation, deadlines, and recognized achievement. Women remained in a domestic environment where adult interaction could be fragmented and heavily mediated by children's needs. One could spend an entire day speaking mostly to toddlers, sales clerks, and brief neighborly encounters. Loneliness does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like too many ordinary afternoons with no witness. This was particularly acute for women who had moved away from extended family networks. The suburban dream often required geographic mobility. Young couples relocated for jobs, mortgages, and opportunity. Parents, siblings, and older relatives might be states away. The emotional support systems that had once softened domestic strain were no longer naturally present. A mother with young children could be profoundly alone in a physically comfortable house. That loneliness was difficult to defend because it sounded ungrateful. How could one complain while living in the very thing others were working toward? A woman could look around her kitchen and see every sign of success and still feel hollow. The contradiction itself produced shame. She had the house. She had the husband. She had the children. She had what she had been told should make happiness almost automatic. If happiness was incomplete, she was likely to blame herself before blaming the structure. This self-blame often turned inward through perfectionism. If emotional fulfillment was missing, perhaps the answer was to become better organized, more patient, thinner, more attractive, more attentive, more cheerful, more competent. The home became a project of moral repair. A cleaner kitchen could briefly feel like proof that life was under control. A successful dinner party could feel like evidence that one was, in fact, enough. But perfectionism is exhausting because it converts ordinary life into permanent evaluation. Every imperfection becomes evidence. Every bad mood becomes a moral test. Pills fit naturally into that emotional economy because they promised optimization. They did not merely relieve suffering. They offered the possibility of being the correct version of oneself. There is another layer here involving consumption. The suburban household was also a marketplace. Women were targeted constantly as consumers because they managed the visible texture of family life. Advertisers sold not just products but identities. The right detergent signaled care. The right food signaled modern motherhood. The right furniture signaled taste. The right beauty routine signaled femininity. Consumption became another form of emotional management. Shopping could therefore feel both necessary and strangely disappointing. One purchased the promise of ease repeatedly. A better mixer, a new dress, improved cookware, the latest household convenience, beauty products, vitamins, medications. Each object carried the suggestion that life could become smoother, more elegant, less tiring. Sometimes it did help. Often the deeper dissatisfaction remained untouched. The emotional gap between the promised life and the lived life persisted, now with more objects inside it. Children, too, became part of suburban performance. Their success reflected parental success. Their manners, appearance, school performance, and social adjustment were read as evidence of the home's moral quality. Mothers were expected to supervise not only physical care but social outcomes. A shy child, a rebellious child, a poorly dressed child, these could feel like personal failures rather than ordinary human variation. This intensified the pressure around emotional control. A mother could not simply be tired. She had to remain the stabilizing center through which the family moved. If she felt panic, sadness, boredom, or rage, she often had to translate it into something socially manageable before it reached the children. The home depended on her emotional filtration. Medication could become part of that filtration system. Some women found real relief in neighborhood female networks. Coffee mornings, school volunteering, church groups, bridge clubs, and informal afternoon visits created spaces where private honesty could briefly surface. These gatherings are sometimes dismissed as trivial in hindsight, but they were often survival structures. They offered adult conversation and the possibility of being seen as something other than service staff for one's own family. Still, those spaces could also reinforce conformity. The same neighbor who offered sympathy might also embody comparison. One woman's immaculate kitchen became another woman's private indictment. One woman's apparently cheerful marriage could deepen another's sense of failure. Female community in suburbia could be both rescue and pressure, intimacy and surveillance at once. The emotional atmosphere of the suburban house was therefore not simply private psychology. It was social architecture. Walls, lawns, mortgages, schools, gender roles, advertising, and medicine all worked together to create a world where women were praised for inhabiting a role that often left little protected space for themselves. The house became both achievement and enclosure. This is why so many later recollections of the period sound divided. Women remembered genuine pleasures, children's laughter, financial security, neighborhood friendships, the pride of building a home, the relief of stability after harder years. But alongside that was often another memory, of quiet panic, of afternoons that stretched endlessly, of feeling intellectually underfed, of swallowing something prescribed and returning to the kitchen because dinner still had to be made. Historical honesty requires holding both truths together. The suburban home was not a prison in the simple dramatic sense, nor was it the uncomplicated paradise of nostalgic advertising. It was a place where love and confinement could coexist. A woman could be grateful and miserable in the same afternoon. She could feel proud of her home and trapped by it. She could adore her children and fear disappearing into the endless repetition of caring for them. And as the decade moved toward the late 1950s and early 1960s, that private contradiction would become increasingly profitable for the pharmaceutical world. New tranquilizers arrived with remarkable cultural force, marketed not as emergency medicine but as companions to ordinary respectable life. The medicine cabinet itself began to change. What had once been occasional prescriptions for nerves became something more routine, more normalized, and more closely tied to the image of the ideal American woman. The symbol of that shift would not be the sleeping pill or even the stimulant, but a newer promise altogether. The idea that one small tablet could smooth anxiety, preserve femininity, protect marriage, and keep the bright suburban machine running without visible strain. And once that promise entered the culture fully, it would reshape not only medicine, but the very way unhappiness inside the American home was understood. By the late 1950s, the tranquilizer had become something more than a prescription. It had become a cultural idea. It represented a new kind of modern promise. Not dramatic cure, but emotional smoothness. One did not need to be seriously ill to qualify for it. One simply needed to be tense, tired, worried, overwhelmed, or not quite equal to the emotional performance expected by ordinary life. That made tranquilizers uniquely suited to the domestic landscape of postwar America, where ordinary life itself could be exhausting and where visible distress was quietly discouraged. The most famous example would arrive with extraordinary force in the early 1960s, but the groundwork had already been carefully prepared. Earlier sedatives such as barbiturates were effective but carried obvious dangers and a heavier social tone. They suggested serious illness or severe insomnia. Newer tranquilizers promised something softer. They sounded cleaner, safer, more refined. Medicine not for collapse, but for adjustment. Their language was not crisis. It was composure. That distinction changed everything. A woman did not need to say she was falling apart. She could simply say she felt tense. She was having trouble sleeping. She felt on edge. She worried too much. She could not relax. The prescription that followed did not necessarily mark her as sick. It could mark her as responsible, someone taking sensible steps to remain functional for her family. Pharmaceutical advertising leaned heavily into this respectability. Doctors were shown elegant women, not broken ones. Mothers in neat dresses. Wives with polished hair. Women whose problem was not chaos, but strain beneath order. The message was clear. The patient was not outside normal life. She was normal life. She was the woman holding it together. Some advertisements framed tranquilizers almost as domestic tools, alongside the washing machine and the refrigerator. Just as modern appliances improved household efficiency, modern medicine could improve emotional management. Anxiety became another household inconvenience to be handled quietly and effectively. The ideal home, after all, was supposed to feel peaceful. If peace required pharmaceutical assistance, that detail remained discreetly offstage. There was a revealing moral tone in these campaigns. A calmer woman was not simply happier. She was better for others. She was more patient with children, more pleasant with guests, more supportive of her husband, more attractive in her femininity, less likely to create emotional disruption. Medication was tied to service. It helped her become the atmosphere the family required. This is where the history becomes especially sharp, because it shows how easily women's emotional lives were folded into collective comfort. A husband's stress from work might be treated as an understandable result of economic pressure. A wife's stress from home was often treated as a problem to be softened so the home itself could remain undisturbed. Her discomfort was significant partly because of what it threatened in others: children's stability, marital peace, social harmony. That did not mean women were simply passive recipients of this logic. Many actively sought help because the pressure was real. If a pill made the day survivable, it mattered very little whether a historian decades later thought the prescription was politically symbolic. Relief is persuasive. When one is tired enough, survival often outranks analysis. And yet, the broader pattern reveals something deeper than individual choices. Women were not being medicated randomly. They were being medicated along the fault lines of a social role. The pills followed the same pressures: motherhood, marriage, beauty, patience, domestic competence, emotional containment. They clustered around the places where the ideal woman was expected to bend without breaking. The phrase "mother's little helper," which would later become culturally famous, carried a cruel kind of accuracy. It sounded affectionate, even playful, but beneath it was a stark truth. The helper was helping her continue helping everyone else. The medicine did not primarily free her from duty. It helped her return to it. This became especially visible in conversations around marriage. Popular advice of the time often treated the emotional climate of marriage as something wives were responsible for managing. A successful husband needed a peaceful home. A good marriage required warmth, admiration, and feminine grace. If a husband withdrew, if tension grew, if intimacy felt strained, women were often encouraged to ask what they might improve: appearance, patience, domestic atmosphere, sexual availability, emotional softness. Very rarely did this advice begin with the assumption that the structure itself might be unequal. Instead, if a wife felt anxious or resentful, medication could be positioned as a tool for restoring harmony. The problem became her tension rather than the conditions producing it. A tranquilizer promised not only calm, but marital usefulness. It could protect the relationship by reducing visible friction, even if the underlying imbalance remained untouched. This is not to say men never took such medications. They did. Anxiety, insomnia, and depression were hardly exclusive to women. But the cultural framing was different. Men were more often treated in relation to work and public pressure. Women were treated in relation to emotional domestic performance. That distinction shaped both diagnosis and prescription. It also shaped shame. A man exhausted by his job could often describe himself as burdened by responsibility. A woman exhausted by her home risked sounding ungrateful for comfort. Her suffering was harder to narrate because it occurred inside what was supposed to be fulfillment itself. This made chemical relief feel especially attractive. It required no ideological explanation. It allowed the appearance of gratitude to remain intact. There is another reason tranquilizers spread so effectively. They aligned perfectly with the post-war American faith in technical solutions. This was a society deeply impressed by modern science. Antibiotics had changed medicine dramatically. Technology had helped win a world war. Consumer appliances were transforming domestic life. The belief that problems could be solved through expert intervention was powerful and sincere. In that world, emotional discomfort could easily be understood as another technical issue awaiting the correct pharmaceutical answer. Why wrestle endlessly with diffuse dissatisfaction if chemistry could restore balance? The idea was not absurd. It fit the logic of the age. It also fit the commercial interests of an expanding drug industry. By the early 1960s, drugs like meprobamate and later benzodiazepines entered this landscape with enormous influence. They were marketed as gentler and safer than older sedatives, though history would reveal complications there too. But what mattered culturally was the promise. They felt modern. They suggested that one could remain fully respectable, fully feminine, fully functional, and simply slightly more manageable to oneself. The medicine cabinet, then, became a quiet archive of emotional life. Behind the mirror were bottles for sleep, for nerves, for appetite, for energy, for headaches, for calm. Each prescription represented not only a symptom but a negotiation between private suffering and public expectation. The cabinet looked orderly. The life around it often depended on that order. Children, of course, noticed things even when they did not understand them. They noticed moods lifting or flattening. They noticed mothers who seemed permanently tired, or strangely distant, or intensely perfectionist. They noticed quiet afternoons and closed bedroom doors. Many later memories of the period carry these half-understood impressions. A mother always anxious before guests arrived, a father dismissing worry as nerves, a sense that something was being managed without ever being named. This intergenerational silence mattered because it helped preserve the myth of effortless domesticity. Children grew up inside homes whose emotional architecture was chemically supported, yet often interpreted that atmosphere as normal womanhood itself. Calm was expected. Self-sacrifice was expected. The invisible labor behind it disappeared into personality. At the same time, there were women who began to resist the language being offered to them. Some noticed that every woman they knew seemed exhausted. Some realized their distress did not vanish after one prescription or 5. Some grew suspicious of the fact that medicine kept treating symptoms that returned with almost mathematical consistency every time domestic life resumed. Why were so many women privately medicated if the ideal life was truly ideal? This question did not arrive all at once. It emerged slowly, often through irritation rather than ideology. A woman might first think not of liberation, but simply of unfairness. Why was her husband's work treated as real labor while hers dissolved into expectation? Why did she need pills to remain pleasant in a life everyone insisted should already be enough? Why did the solution always seem to involve making her quieter rather than making the arrangement itself more humane? These questions were dangerous not because they were loud, but because they were clarifying. Once a woman begins to suspect that her distress is not entirely private, medication changes meaning. It may still help, but it no longer fully explains. The tranquilizer stops being the answer and starts looking like evidence. Evidence that the role itself may be unsustainably designed. This shift would help fuel broader social conversations in the 1960s, but in the late 1950s it often remained private. It lived in journals, in friendships, intense conversations between spouses, in quiet envy of women who worked outside the home, in the uneasy feeling that adulthood had narrowed rather than expanded. Many women were not rejecting family life. They were rejecting the idea that family life should consume the entire self. And that distinction matters historically because it prevents easy caricature. The story is not simply one of oppressed women versus happy homemakers. It is a story of women trying to build meaningful lives inside a system that praised them most when they were least visible as separate people. Pills entered that story not as the main villain, but as one of its most revealing artifacts. The suburban mother taking a tranquilizer before the afternoon school run was not necessarily a symbol of weakness. She might be intelligent, competent, deeply loving, and carrying far more than anyone around her had learned to recognize. The pill was sometimes a compromise with reality, sometimes a trap, sometimes a temporary kindness, sometimes the beginning of dependency. Often it was all of those things at once. Even the language of dependency could be misleading. Society depended on her long before she depended on the medicine. The family depended on her patience. The husband depended on her emotional steadiness. The neighborhood depended on her social labor. The national ideal depended on her performance of cheerful domestic femininity. The medication simply entered a system already built on asymmetric reliance. By the time the famous tranquilizer era reached full cultural visibility, the foundations had already been laid in kitchens, bedrooms, pediatric appointments, grocery stores, and suburban living rooms across America. The question was no longer whether women were being quietly medicated. It was whether the culture was finally prepared to ask why. And the answer would not come first from doctors or drug companies. It would come from women comparing private lives and recognizing a shared pattern, one that stretched far beyond pills and into the deeper structure of education, ambition, marriage, money, and the uncomfortable possibility that the American dream had assigned women a role far smaller than the size of their minds. One of the quietest but most important tensions inside 1950s domestic life was education. Many women living in those suburban homes were not intellectually unformed people who had simply wandered into marriage without alternatives. They had gone to college. They had read seriously. Some had worked during the war. Some had imagined professional futures before marriage redirected the shape of adulthood. Even those who had fully expected to become wives and mothers often entered marriage with capacities and ambitions far broader than the domestic script ultimately allowed them to use. This created a particularly painful kind of invisibility. A woman could be admired for being bright in a social sense, good conversation, tasteful opinions, capable management of the home, while the deeper uses of intelligence remained underemployed. She could be praised for helping children with homework, organizing charity events, or hosting articulate dinner conversation, yet feel that her mind had been gradually reduced to support work for other people's lives. That reduction was rarely dramatic enough to look like tragedy from the outside. It looked like success. The house was comfortable. The children were healthy. The husband's career was progressing. There was food in the refrigerator, good schools nearby, and a respectable address. But inner diminishment does not always announce itself with obvious disaster. Sometimes it arrives as a low, persistent feeling that one's life has become strangely smaller than one's capacity. This is part of why so much of the era's unhappiness was difficult to diagnose. There was no single event to point to, no obvious villain, no public crisis. There was simply the slow recognition that the adult self one had imagined had narrowed into a highly managed domestic identity, and that admitting disappointment felt almost indecent because the life itself looked so fortunate. Women's colleges and universities of the period often existed inside this contradiction. Education was encouraged, but not always for independence. A college education could increase marriage prospects, social polish, and maternal competence. It made a woman interesting but not necessarily autonomous. She was expected to be cultivated, not fully self-defining. Intellectual development was admired as long as it did not destabilize domestic hierarchy. This expectation shaped the emotional tone of many marriages. A woman might be genuinely proud of her husband's professional success and still feel an ache watching him inhabit a world of recognized work, adult conversation, and visible progress while her own days repeated in a closed domestic loop. Resentment here was often quiet because it collided with love. She did not necessarily want his life instead of her family. She wanted the dignity of being understood as equally real. The problem became sharper after children grew older. Early motherhood, for all its exhaustion, was undeniably full of immediate necessity. Babies required constant attention. Toddlers filled time completely. But as children entered school, many women encountered a strange emotional shift. The practical demands changed, yet the cultural expectation remained that full devotion to home should still feel sufficient. Afternoons became quieter. The house stayed clean longer. Silence entered the rooms. For some women, that silence was relief. For others, it was terrifying, because silence created space for thought. In those quieter hours, the carefully maintained routines could begin to feel exposed. One could ask questions previously drowned out by diapers and lunchboxes. Is this all? What exactly am I doing with the next 20 years? Why do I feel guilty for wanting more? Why does every attempt to name this sound selfish? These were dangerous questions because they threatened the moral clarity of the domestic ideal. If motherhood alone was supposed to complete adult womanhood, then dissatisfaction after motherhood's most physically demanding years should not exist. Yet it did, and often it emerged most strongly not in women who rejected family life, but in women who had performed it most faithfully. This was the emotional terrain that later writers would describe more publicly, but long before publication and public language, it existed as a private pressure inside ordinary homes. Some women tried to solve it through busyness. Volunteer work expanded. School committees multiplied. Church leadership became more serious. Community organizations filled calendars. These were meaningful activities and often genuinely valuable, but they could also function as a socially acceptable substitute for the professional identity or intellectual seriousness women were discouraged from pursuing directly. One could be extremely competent while still being described as just helping out. That phrase, just helping out, contains an entire social philosophy. It suggested that women's labor, even when highly skilled, should remain adjacent rather than central. Leadership was acceptable if it looked like service. Intelligence was acceptable if it supported family or community rather than self-definition. A woman could work endlessly as long as the work did not threaten the assumption that her primary identity belonged inside the home. Pills fit neatly into this arrangement because they treated strain without challenging structure. If volunteer obligations, school demands, social hosting, beauty maintenance, and domestic labor became overwhelming, the answer remained adjustment, not redistribution. Calm down. Sleep better. Stay slim. Keep going. Some women returned to paid work, but even that path was complicated. Economic necessity made employment respectable in some cases, but ambition for its own sake could still attract suspicion. A mother who wanted work because she needed intellectual engagement risked being seen as neglectful or dissatisfied inappropriately. The question was not simply whether she worked, but why. Motivation itself became morally judged. This moral scrutiny meant that even women who succeeded in building broader lives often carried a layer of defensiveness. They had to explain themselves, Their desire for work needed justification beyond personal fulfillment. It had to be practical, noble, or temporary. Wanting a larger life because one's mind demanded it was not yet a fully comfortable public sentence. This is why friendship between women became such an important political space before it was openly political. Over coffee, in parked cars after school pickup, in long phone calls during nap hours, women compared realities. One admitted she missed working. Another admitted she sometimes dreaded the sameness of the day. Another confessed she had been prescribed something for the nerves. Another laughed too hard at the idea that housework was supposed to be naturally fulfilling. These conversations mattered because they challenged isolation. Isolation protects ideology. If every woman believes she alone is failing to enjoy the ideal, she blames herself. Once she realizes many women are privately carrying the same dissatisfaction, the question shifts. Perhaps the problem is not personal inadequacy. Perhaps the role itself is too narrow. That realization rarely arrived as immediate rebellion. More often it arrived as clarity, and clarity can be quieter than anger. A woman might continue cooking dinner, attending church, helping with homework, and taking prescribed medication while privately understanding her life differently than before. She had not escaped the system, but she had stopped fully believing its explanation of her unhappiness. This inner shift changed the meaning of everything around her. The pills in the bathroom cabinet no longer looked like proof of her weakness. They looked like evidence of a broader design problem. The constant fatigue no longer felt like a personal moral failure. It looked like the predictable result of invisible labor without boundaries. The sadness did not necessarily disappear, but it became interpretable. Interpretation matters. People can endure difficult lives more honestly when they understand what is happening to them. Popular culture, however, was slow to make room for that understanding. Television, advertisements, magazines, and films continued to project a polished version of domestic femininity that was both seductive and punishing. The smiling mother in the kitchen was not simply an image. She was a measuring device. Real women stood beside that image and judged themselves. Even humor could reinforce it. Jokes about female nerves, shopping habits, housewife boredom, or little tranquilizers often disguised structural critique inside light entertainment. The audience laughed because the recognition was real, but laughter did not necessarily produce change. Sometimes it simply made contradiction socially survivable for another year. Men, too, were beginning to notice cracks, though often without language for them. Some husbands genuinely did not understand why wives who seemed materially secure were unhappy. Others recognized the strain but had been taught to interpret care almost entirely through provision. If the mortgage was paid and the children were safe, what exactly was missing? Emotional inequality is difficult to see when one's own role is treated as the unquestioned center of adulthood. For many marriages, this gap produced a subtle coldness rather than dramatic conflict. A husband might love his wife and still fail to understand her loneliness. A wife might admire her husband and still resent the freedom he took for granted. No one needed to be monstrous for the arrangement to feel unfair. Ordinary affection could coexist with profound structural imbalance. That complexity is important because history becomes shallow when reduced to villains. The problem was not simply bad husbands or foolish doctors. It was a cultural architecture so widely accepted that many kind people participated in maintaining it. Men benefited from it. Women often defended it. Institutions rewarded it. Medicine softened its consequences. And because it looked like success from the outside, questioning it felt like ingratitude. This is why the language that would emerge in the 1960s felt so powerful. It did not invent female dissatisfaction. It named it. Naming changes scale. What had felt like private confusion became part of a recognized pattern. A woman reading someone else describe her exact unnamed fatigue could experience something close to relief. Not because her life instantly changed, but because loneliness lost some of its authority. Before that public naming fully arrived, though, there was still the daily reality of management. The pills, the laundry, the school lunches, the beauty routines, the quiet resentment, the apology for feeling resentful, the repeated promise that tomorrow would feel more satisfying if only one became slightly better at being the person everyone required. And beneath all of that sat another often unspoken force: money. For all the language of domestic fulfillment, economic dependence shaped nearly everything. A suburban housewife's comfort often rested on a financial structure she did not control. The home might feel like hers in responsibility, but not always in ownership. The mortgage, the salary, the retirement plan, the professional identity attached to the family name, these were usually tied to the husband's work. This dependency was not always experienced as oppression. Sometimes it felt like security. Sometimes it was both. But security with limited economic autonomy carries a specific kind of silence. Leaving an unhappy marriage, even imagining life outside it, became far more complicated when one's entire social and financial stability depended on remaining inside the arrangement. Even dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with wanting to leave was shaped by this fact. A woman could not easily experiment with independence when dependence had been built into the design of respectable adulthood. This made emotional compliance even more valuable. If one's material life depended on maintaining a functioning marriage, preserving peace was not merely sentimental. It was practical. Tranquility had financial consequences. A pill that made one more patient could feel, in a quiet and unsettling sense, like part of household economics. And this economic structure shaped how doctors, husbands, and even women themselves interpreted distress. A woman asking for more than domestic fulfillment could be heard not only as emotionally dissatisfied, but as threatening the stability of the family unit. Her unhappiness was therefore not just personal. It risked becoming socially disruptive, which is why, as the decade moved forward, the cultural defense of the ideal housewife became more intense precisely as private dissatisfaction grew harder to ignore. The brighter the public image, the more interesting the shadow behind it became. And in that shadow, a generation of women was beginning to ask whether the pills were treating anxiety, or simply helping them survive a definition of womanhood that had been made far too small. That question became even sharper when women looked not only at their emotional lives, but at the practical structure underneath them. It is difficult to talk honestly about 1950s domestic life without talking about dependence, because dependence shaped the emotional rules of the household long before anyone reached for a prescription bottle. The ideal housewife was often praised as the queen of the home, but queens rarely need permission to buy groceries, leave a marriage, or imagine a future outside the walls of the house. Many women in post-war America were surrounded by symbols of prosperity while possessing surprisingly little direct control over the economic machinery that sustained it. This did not always feel oppressive in obvious daily ways. Many husbands handed over household money responsibly. Many marriages were affectionate and cooperative. Some women preferred the arrangement sincerely, especially after witnessing the insecurity of earlier decades. Financial dependence could feel like stability rather than confinement. That is precisely why it was so powerful. Systems endure most effectively when they can be experienced as protection and limitation at the same time. But the limits were real. Credit, property, major financial decisions, and long-term security were often structured around male employment and male legal authority. A woman might manage every practical detail of the household while having little independent financial identity. She could be the operating center of family life and still remain economically secondary in the formal sense. Her labor was indispensable, but because it was unpaid, it could be treated as naturally owed rather than professionally valued. This imbalance changed the emotional atmosphere of marriage in quiet ways. When one person's work is treated as the family's economic foundation and the other's as background support, authority begins to follow income, even if no one speaks about it directly. A husband's exhaustion from work could be seen as carrying the mortgage. A wife's exhaustion from home could be seen as part of ordinary femininity. One fatigue was financially visible. The other was morally expected. That visibility mattered during arguments, during decisions, during moments of private self-doubt. A woman who felt unhappy might ask herself not only whether her feelings were justified, but whether she had the right to disrupt a structure materially built around someone else's paycheck. Gratitude and dependence could become difficult to separate. If a husband provided the home, the car, the school district, the vacations, the insurance, then dissatisfaction could feel dangerously close to betrayal. This is one reason many women describe themselves as trapped even inside marriages without dramatic abuse. Confinement does not always require overt cruelty. Sometimes it grows from the knowledge that one's entire practical life has been organized around a role that leaves very little room for autonomous movement. To question that arrangement is not just emotional rebellion. It is logistical risk. And so emotional self-management became even more important. Peace in the home protected more than feelings. It protected housing, children's routines, social reputation, and financial continuity. A tranquilizer taken to avoid another argument, or to remain calm enough to survive one, was connected to far more than mood. It was tied to the architecture of security itself. The cultural language around divorce made this sharper. In the 1950s, divorce existed, of course, but it still carried significant social stigma, especially for middle-class women raising children. A divorced woman did not simply lose a marriage. She often lost status, economic safety, neighborhood belonging, and the moral legitimacy that respectable domesticity provided. Even women who had no desire to leave their marriages lived with the knowledge that marriage was not merely emotional companionship. It was institutional survival. That knowledge shaped silence. A wife might decide not to push a conversation because the cost of disruption felt too high. She might interpret her own sadness as something to be privately managed because public conflict threatened too much. She might seek medication not because the marriage was broken, but because the emotional friction of ordinary inequality felt impossible to explain without sounding ungrateful or disloyal. This is where the history resists simple modern judgment. It is easy to ask why women did not simply insist on more work outside the home or leave unhappy arrangements. But choices are made inside conditions, not outside them. A woman with children, no independent savings, social expectations pressing from every direction, and a genuine desire not to destroy family stability was not making decisions from an abstract place of freedom. She was negotiating reality. Even those who returned to work often did so under carefully controlled social terms. Certain professions remained more acceptable: teaching, nursing, clerical work, part-time office roles, community-based positions. These could be framed as extensions of feminine care or practical necessity rather than full challenges to domestic hierarchy. But work that signaled strong personal ambition could still be interpreted as unsettling. It raised uncomfortable questions. Why is home not enough? What exactly is she seeking? That suspicion reveals how tightly female ambition and female morality were linked. Men were expected to pursue achievement. Women were expected to justify it. A husband staying late at the office might be admired for dedication. A wife pursuing serious work risked being asked whether she was neglecting what mattered most. The emotional burden of explanation was constant. Some women internalized this so deeply that they apologized for their own hunger, for work, for thought, for solitude, for adult recognition. They framed it as selfishness rather than humanity. This internal apology is one of the quiet tragedies of the period. It turned perfectly ordinary human needs into private evidence of failure. And again, pills fit neatly into that moral landscape. If the problem was framed as nervousness, fatigue, or mild depression, then medication preserved innocence. One was not selfish. One was simply tired. One was not rejecting domestic life. One just needed help coping with it. This made the prescription culturally safer than direct confrontation with the deeper issue. There was also the question of sexuality, often left politely unspoken in public accounts of the decade, but deeply connected to women's emotional lives. Marriage in the 1950s carried strong expectations around feminine availability, desirability, and marital duty. A woman was expected to remain attractive and emotionally warm, even while carrying exhausting domestic labor. Desire itself could become another performance obligation rather than a freely negotiated part of intimacy. This created another layer of quiet strain. Fatigue affects intimacy. Resentment affects intimacy. Feeling invisible affects intimacy. But rather than asking what in the relationship might be producing emotional distance, the burden often returned to the wife's emotional management. She was expected to preserve not only the household's order but its warmth. If she felt detached, medication could once again be offered as restoration rather than inquiry. Beauty culture intensified this pressure. The polished suburban wife was not an accidental image. It was a demand. Hair, makeup, weight, clothing, posture, graciousness. All of it signaled successful femininity. To let oneself go was not treated as a neutral change. It was read as moral decline, marital risk, or emotional instability. Looking well was part of keeping the household well. This is why appetite suppressants and stimulants mattered so much. They were not vanity products in a shallow sense. They were tied to marriage, status, self-respect, and the fear of becoming invisible in the wrong way. A woman who was already emotionally depleted could be chemically pushed toward greater energy and thinner appearance, all in service of maintaining the correct visible self. The contradiction is almost painful in its precision. A culture telling women they should be fulfilled by home while constantly requiring proof that they had not been consumed by it. Children often sat at the center of these contradictions. A mother might tell herself she stayed silent for them, took the pills for them, remained patient for them, accepted smaller dreams for them. And often this was true. Love made sacrifice meaningful. But love also made it easier for a system to demand endless sacrifice without naming it as such. When every surrender can be described as maternal devotion, limits become morally difficult to defend. Some women eventually recognized that children did not necessarily benefit from a mother whose entire self had been erased. They began to ask a subtler question. What does it teach a daughter to watch her mother disappear? What does it teach a son to grow up assuming female exhaustion is ordinary? These questions did not yet dominate public conversation, but they were beginning to surface in private reflection. This is where generational memory becomes especially powerful. Many daughters of the period would later describe sensing something before they had words for it. Mothers who were brilliant and strangely absent from themselves, women who seemed permanently tired, women who had talent without clear ownership of it, women who laughed at jokes about nerves with a little too much recognition. The children of these homes inherited not only stability, but a model of femininity built on invisible depletion. At the same time, the era cannot be honestly understood without acknowledging real affection and real pride inside many of these homes. Women were not merely victims moving through empty lives. Many loved motherhood deeply. Many found real pleasure in community, beauty, ritual, and family life. Many were proud of the homes they built. Historical truth requires resisting the temptation to flatten everything into misery. The power of the story lies precisely in the coexistence of gratitude and dissatisfaction. A woman could love her children and still mourn the shrinking of her world. She could admire her husband and still resent the freedom his adulthood seemed to include. She could be proud of her house and still feel that its walls had become too intimate with her loneliness. Human beings are capable of holding contradictory truths at once. The 1950s housewife often had to. That complexity is also why the cultural shift of the 1960s felt so disruptive. It was not simply an attack on family values, as some critics feared. It was, for many women, an attempt to describe reality more honestly. The pills had become a clue. Why did so many respectable women need chemical assistance to perform a role supposedly aligned with nature, morality, and happiness? Why was private suffering so widespread inside public success? Once those questions were asked clearly enough, they were difficult to silence again. Doctors began to hear them differently. Husbands encountered them differently. Publishers recognized an audience hungry for language. The tranquilizer bottle in the bathroom cabinet stopped looking like a small private detail and started looking like part of a national emotional pattern. And yet, before books and public arguments gave that pattern formal shape, there was still the ordinary daily choreography of concealment. Smiling at neighbors, setting the table, attending school meetings, adjusting children's collars before church, keeping the guest bathroom presentable, answering "I'm fine" when asked how things were going, and swallowing something small enough to make the answer feel temporarily true. It is in that ordinary choreography that the deeper history lives. Not in dramatic rebellion, but in repetition. In the way entire systems can be sustained by millions of women performing emotional steadiness while privately wondering whether steadiness is the same thing as happiness. And as more women began to quietly realize that it was not, the next shift would come not from a medicine cabinet or a doctor's office, but from the dangerous power of seeing one's private life described in public, and realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the problem had never been hers alone. Few moments in modern American social history capture that recognition more clearly than the sudden force with which certain words seemed to explain lives people had been living for years without. Language. By the early 1960s, the emotional architecture of the 1950s housewife had not disappeared. The kitchens were still there, the suburban routines still there, the pills still there, the carefully maintained smiles still there. But something had begun to shift beneath the surface. Private dissatisfaction was becoming discussable. This did not happen because millions of women woke up one morning and collectively rejected domestic life. It happened because enough women had spent enough years quietly feeling the same contradiction that when someone finally described it plainly, the recognition was immediate and unsettling. The phrase often remembered, "the problem that has no name," became powerful not because it was poetic, but because it was ordinary. It described a condition that many women had already been living, a persistent sense of incompleteness inside lives that were publicly praised as ideal. What made that recognition so destabilizing was that it did not accuse individual women of failure. It suggested the opposite. It implied that the exhaustion, guilt, restlessness, and low-grade despair many women carried were not personal defects to be medicated away, but rational responses to a social arrangement too narrow for the lives inside it. That idea changed the emotional meaning of the tranquilizer bottle. A pill once understood as proof of nervous fragility could begin to look like evidence of a structural problem. Why were so many healthy, competent, intelligent women privately relying on medication just to remain pleasant inside ordinary domestic life? Why did the ideal require chemical reinforcement? The question was not anti-medicine. It was anti-silence. Of course, not every woman responded the same way. Some felt relief reading public descriptions of domestic dissatisfaction. Others felt anger, defensiveness, or deep disagreement. Many genuinely valued full-time motherhood and saw criticism of domestic life as criticism of their own meaningful choices. That distinction mattered then and still matters now. The issue was never that motherhood itself was fraudulent. It was the insistence that motherhood must be sufficient for every woman, and that if it was not, the deficiency belonged to her. This nuance is often lost in simplified retellings. The emerging critique of the housewife ideal was not necessarily a rejection of family, children, or home. It was a rejection of compulsory smallness. It challenged the assumption that women's ambitions should politely stop where domestic comfort began. It asked whether intelligence, adulthood, and selfhood could survive inside a system that praised women most when they made themselves least visible as separate people. For many women, the most shocking part was not disagreement but recognition. They had assumed their unhappiness was private. To discover it was widely shared could feel like emotional reorientation. Loneliness depends partly on believing one is alone. Once that belief cracks, the entire landscape changes. Conversations shifted. Women who had once whispered about fatigue or nerves began talking more directly about boredom, lost ambition, unequal marriages, intellectual hunger, and the strange emptiness of a life organized entirely around service. The language itself mattered. One can endure a great deal when one has words for it. Without language, suffering often turns inward and becomes shame. The medical system, however, did not change overnight. Doctors continued prescribing tranquilizers in enormous numbers. In fact, the popularity of these medications grew even as broader social critique expanded. This apparent contradiction makes sense when viewed closely. Recognition does not instantly erase responsibility. A woman who understood perfectly well that her life was structurally constrained still had to make breakfast, manage children, maintain marriages, and function tomorrow morning. Political clarity does not automatically provide practical relief, so the pills remained. In some cases, women used medication while simultaneously questioning the very world that made it necessary. A tranquilizer could be both a comfort and a symbol of frustration. One could take it and resent needing it. One could be grateful for temporary calm while privately understanding that calm was being purchased at the cost of deeper change. This emotional doubleness defined much of the period. The early 1960s were not a clean break from the 1950s but a strange overlap of old expectations and new language. Women stood in kitchens with new ideas and old obligations. They read challenging books between grocery lists. They attended school meetings while thinking thoughts that no longer fit neatly into the role assigned to them. Some returned to education. Some sought work. Some changed marriages slowly through difficult conversations. Some did none of those things and simply refused internally to believe that their exhaustion was a moral failure. Even that private refusal mattered. The pharmaceutical industry, meanwhile, continued adapting with remarkable skill. If women were becoming more aware of the limits of domestic life, medicine could still present itself as a neutral ally. Tranquilizers were not marketed as ideological tools. They were marketed as relief, as modern care, as scientific compassion. A woman did not need to choose between critique and medication. The culture made room for both. This is why the figure of the medicated suburban wife became so symbolically powerful. She stood at the intersection of competing stories about American womanhood. In one story, she was the beneficiary of postwar abundance. Safe, comfortable, admired, and fortunate. In another, she was a highly capable adult confined inside a role so emotionally demanding that pharmacological support had become ordinary. Both stories contained truth. Their collision produced the tension. Popular culture began to reflect this more openly. Jokes about tranquilizers multiplied. Magazine articles shifted in tone. Advice columns became slightly less certain that domestic perfection was naturally fulfilling. Television still projected polished femininity, but cracks were visible in the performance. The happy housewife was becoming too familiar as a stereotype to remain entirely convincing as reality. Husbands, too, were pulled into this changing atmosphere. Some resisted it fiercely, interpreting female dissatisfaction as ingratitude or cultural decline. Others were confused, having genuinely believed they were building the good life they had both been taught to want. Many marriages entered a new kind of negotiation, not necessarily dramatic conflict, but uncomfortable reinterpretation. If a wife's sadness was not simply nerves, then what exactly was being asked of the marriage? That question could be difficult because it challenged more than household routines. Challenged male identity. If a man had understood himself primarily as provider and protector, and if he had measured love through stability and financial security, then hearing that stability was not enough could feel like accusation even when it was not intended that way. Emotional equality asks for a different kind of attention than economic provision. Some men adapted, some did not. Many families lived for years inside that uncertain middle space where no one was entirely wrong, but the old arrangement no longer felt honest. Children also grew up differently inside this atmosphere. Daughters watched mothers who were beginning to speak differently about themselves. Sons watched fathers and mothers renegotiate expectations that had once seemed unquestioned. The domestic world of the 1960s still resembled the 1950s on the surface, but the emotional script was changing. It became harder to assume that female self-sacrifice was simply natural. This is one reason historical nostalgia for the 1950s often feels incomplete. It remembers polished surfaces without the long conversations that followed them. It remembers stability without the cost of maintaining it. It remembers orderly homes but forgets how many of those homes were sustained by women privately medicating their anxiety while publicly performing gratitude. The pills themselves became almost too ordinary to notice. That ordinariness is perhaps the most revealing part of the story. A crisis is easy to identify because it looks exceptional. The history here is more unsettling because it looked normal. Doctors prescribed. Women swallowed. Husbands went to work. Children went to school. Dinner was served. Nothing appeared dramatic enough to count as social failure, and yet millions of people were living inside a quiet emotional imbalance. That imbalance was not solved simply by public recognition. Awareness created friction, not instant freedom. Women still faced economic dependence, cultural judgment, limited childcare options, professional barriers, and marriages built on assumptions decades old. Naming the problem did not remove the mortgage or rewrite gender expectations overnight. But naming did something equally important. It weakened the authority of shame. A woman who once believed she was privately inadequate could begin to understand herself historically. She was not failing to enjoy a perfect life. She was living inside a specific system with specific demands, and those demands were not morally neutral. They had been designed by institutions, markets, laws, religious assumptions, educational expectations, and inherited beliefs about what women were for. Once seen that way, the pills became less mysterious. They were not random excess. They were logical products of a world asking women to remain endlessly calm, beautiful, available, selfless, and grateful while denying many of them the full dignity of adult self-definition. There is a strange honesty in the medicine cabinet because it tells the truth the advertisements could not. Behind the smiling kitchen photographs and the polished family portraits sat evidence that domestic perfection was difficult to inhabit without assistance. The bottle behind the mirror often knew more about the era than the television commercial did. And still, even as critique deepened, many women continued to protect the very world that constrained them. This is not hypocrisy. Human beings defend what they have built, especially when love lives inside it. A woman could recognize the injustice of her role and still fiercely protect her family, her marriage, her children's sense of safety, and the home she had spent years making real. Change rarely arrives through clean rejection. More often it arrives through painful attempts to expand a life without destroying everything meaningful inside it. That tension shaped the next stage of the story. The question was no longer simply why housewives took so many pills. It was what happened when those same women began asking for something medicine could not prescribe: authority over the shape of their own adulthood. Because once that demand entered the conversation, quietly at first, then louder, the tranquilizer was no longer just a household secret. It became a witness, a small glass bottle sitting in a suburban bathroom, quietly testifying that the brightest version of the American dream had required far more sedation than anyone wanted to admit. And from there, the story moves outward into workplaces, universities, marriages, and public life, where the private chemistry of the home would begin colliding with a much larger argument about what women were allowed to be. And from there, the story moves outward into workplaces, universities, marriages, and public life, where the private chemistry of the home would begin colliding with a much larger argument about what women were allowed to be. By the late 1960s and into the years that followed, the conversation could no longer be kept politely inside kitchens and doctors' offices. What had once been described as nerves, personal weakness, or private dissatisfaction was increasingly understood as part of a larger historical structure. Women were not simply asking for better pills. They were asking harder questions about work, education, marriage, money, sexuality, childcare, and the basic shape of adult dignity. That did not mean the old world vanished. Far from it. Many women continued to live inside the same domestic expectations, and many still found real meaning there. The suburban home did not suddenly become empty of love or value, but the certainty surrounding it changed. The housewife ideal was no longer protected by silence. It had to defend itself, and once a role must defend itself, it stops feeling natural. Some women entered paid work for the first time. Others returned to unfinished ambitions they had once set aside. Some renegotiated marriages slowly and painfully. Some left marriages. Some stayed and demanded different terms. Some found language in books, some in friendships, some in exhaustion itself. Not every life transformed dramatically. Many changes were small. Separate bank accounts, night classes, honest conversations, fewer apologies for wanting solitude, the quiet refusal to believe that female unhappiness was simply bad gratitude. Even medicine changed in meaning. Tranquilizers did not disappear. They remained part of American life, and for many people they provided real relief. But the cultural image of the medicated housewife became harder to ignore as harmless normality. It became a symbol, sometimes mocked, sometimes pitted, sometimes deeply understood, of a society that had tried to solve structural inequality with private sedation. That symbol remains powerful because it reveals something uncomfortable and timeless. When a culture insists too strongly that a certain life should make people happy, it often becomes very skilled at treating the symptoms of unhappiness instead of questioning the design of the life itself. The 1950s American housewife was never just one woman. She was a national idea, built from advertisements, politics, economic structures, gender expectations, and genuine human longing for safety after years of instability. Many women entered that life with hope. Many built loving families inside it. Many also found themselves quietly exhausted by the emotional cost of performing perfection. The pills tell us where the strain lived. They tell us that beneath the polished kitchens and the smiling photographs, there were women trying to sleep, trying to stay patient, trying not to cry unexpectedly, trying to remain thin, trying to be cheerful for children, trying to preserve marriages, trying to make gratitude feel as natural as everyone said it should. They were not weak. In many cases, they were carrying an impossible emotional load with remarkable discipline. History is often kinder when it stops asking why people were not stronger and starts asking what exactly they were being asked to survive. That is the real lesson here. Why did so many 1950s American housewives take so many pills? Because the role they were given demanded more than appearances admitted. It demanded constant emotional regulation, unpaid labor without clear recognition, beauty without exhaustion, motherhood without ambivalence, marriage without resentment, gratitude without boredom, and adulthood without too much visible selfhood. It asked women to hold entire households together while often giving them very little protected space to remain whole themselves. The tranquilizer was never the whole story. It was a clue, a small clue, hidden in a handbag or behind a bathroom mirror, pointing toward a much larger truth. That comfort and confinement can live in the same room, that love and loneliness can exist in the same marriage, and that a life praised by everyone else can still feel quietly unbearable to the person living it. Perhaps that is why this history still feels familiar. The details change, the kitchens change, the prescriptions change, but the tension between public performance and private exhaustion remains one of the oldest human stories. The question of how much of oneself should be sacrificed to keep life looking stable never fully disappears. And maybe that is why the image of the smiling suburban mother, standing in perfect light with a spotless kitchen behind her, still unsettles people when they look closely enough. Because once you know what was often hidden behind that image, it becomes impossible to see it as simple nostalgia. You begin to see the labor, the silence, the swallowed resentment, the ordinary bravery, the little bottle in the drawer. And perhaps the most respectful thing history can do is refuse to laugh too easily at Mother's Little Helper, and instead ask what kind of world made so many women feel they needed one. If there is a final reflection here, it may be this: people do not usually medicate happiness. They medicate strain. And when an entire generation of respectable, capable women is quietly medicating the same strain, history asks us not to judge them first, but to examine the world that taught them calm was more important than honesty. So if one detail from the story stayed with you most, the suburban loneliness, the invisible labor, the doctor's prescription, the silence inside seemingly perfect homes, I'd be curious to know which part felt hardest to imagine living through. And if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the hidden realities of the past, subscribe for more stories that look beyond the polished surface and into the lives people were actually living. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that history is often at its most revealing not in grand events, but in the ordinary things people kept hidden just to get through the day.